Good morning. I am calling to order the Finance and Administration Committee on Board of Directors meeting for January 27th, 2022. Our first item of business is to call the roll.
Good morning, Director Gibson.
Here.
Director Schmidt
Here.
and Chair Kohler.
I'm here. I'm now looking for a motion to adopt the agenda.
Move approval that we adopt the agenda.
Second.
Sorry, do we have any public comment on the agenda?
Not on the agenda. Oh,
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yes, Laura Ethel just raised her hand. Go ahead, Miss Ethel.
Thank you. On a previous version of this agenda, there was an item about desalination, and that's been removed from the current version. Can I be told why that was removed?
Director Kohler, would you like me to?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that was just my decision looking at this agenda. It's rather full for a committee to hold it off. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Do we have any comments on the agenda?
there are none.
Okay, I'm sorry, we did have a motion and a second, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, then we just need the roll call vote.
Director Gibson,
Aye.
Director Schmidt,
Aye.
Chair Kohler.
Aye. That brings us to public comments on items that are not on the agenda. Do we have any public comments, Terry?
There are none.
Okey dokey. Sorry, I just lost my agenda. Give me a second. Okay, so that brings us to the minutes. I need a motion to adopt the minutes of the last meeting.
Move approval of the minutes.
I need a second.
I wasn't at the last meeting, so I could second it, but given our numbers, but make that note.
Do we want to postpone the approval and see if Director Russell shows up so that we have a?
If you think
Yeah.
that's the best way to go,
Can't Cynthia second that motion?
I can second it, but
I think even Director Schmidt could second the motion. It's just if you're comfortable moving forward with one abstention on the vote, that's fine.
I think the question is, are you comfortable? I'm happy to put it off, but I
It can be approved. I was just offering the option to postpone if there's any.
Well,
It can be approved.
Sorry, in the interest of just moving forward, why don't we go ahead and take that vote, and we can always amend it and come back to it if Director Russell joins us.
Okay, that works.
Director Gibson,
Aye.
Director Schmidt,
Same.
and Chair
Aye.
Kohler.
Aye. That brings us on to item 2, the 2020 census data and adjustment of the boundaries.
And
That's
You
me.
guys-
Terry's pulling up a PowerPoint.
Okay.
okay,
All right. Good morning, directors and members of the public. My name is Jared Mills. I'm the staff attorney here at Marin Water. And this morning, I'm going to speak to you about the 2020 census data and the redistricting process. Just for members of the public and the board, really quickly, Terry, if you go back to the previous slide. Our current board division boundaries can be located at our website. Down here is the link. marinwater.org/board of directors. This is an interactive map that would allow the public to see the current division boundaries if they're interested in doing so. Okay, Terry, you can continue. Okay, so why we're here this morning, basically our Enabling Act and Water Code Section 71540 states that we're required to change division boundaries in accordance with the Elections Code section cited there. That Elections Code section requires us to adjust division boundaries following the census, which is conducted every 10 years to ensure that the divisions are as close as practicable to equal size in population and also comply with state and federal voting rights laws. Okay, Terry. So in addition to ensuring that the populations are near equal within the divisions, and that the divisions comply with, state and federal voting rights laws. Additionally, the board may consider, pursuant to the elections code, these following 4 factors. That's the topography of the individual districts, the geography, ensuring that the districts are cohesive and compact, so they're not spread out, and we're favoring more near populations geographically instead of further. And then the 4th one's community of interest. So this is kind of communities that share either the same economic or maybe cultural backgrounds. So think urban versus rural, maybe agricultural versus businesses that are non-agricultural. Okay, Terry, you can continue. So we first presented this to the board at a Finance and Administration Committee back in September, I think 23rd, 2021. Since that happened, we've received the final adjusted 2020 census data, which was substantially delayed just due to COVID. And then additionally, the legislature has passed Senate Bill 594 since that meeting. Senate Bill 594 requires the district to essentially adopt by resolution its final adjusted division maps by no later than April 17th, 2022. Next slide, please. So the current census data that we received from 2020, staff's been evaluating that and crunching those numbers. Essentially, the bottom line is the total population within the district service area has increased by 8,211 people. The total population of the district's now up to 192,961. You can see that's up from 2010, which was about 184,000. That's increased the average number per division population to about 38,500. Okay, Terry, next slide. Whenever we break that down between the 5 divisions, and just for, if there are members of the public attending today who are unfamiliar with this, each of our directors, they serve a geographical division within our service area. As I pointed out on the first slide today, there's a map online that shows the exact geographical area. And we also have on that webpage more information about the terms of each of the directors. But on here, we have the population for 2010, which was the last census, and then the current census data in 2020. You can see the population gains within each division. As you'll see, though, what happens whenever we calculate the population gains, add those in, most districts are pretty close to the ideal number of that almost 38,500. So Terry, based upon this, can you go on the next slide? So just based upon those population numbers, when we look at this, in staff's opinion, we're not seeing any reasons or rationales for adjustments based solely on population, because the way that the population growth has been distributed, we're still remaining in about near equal populations. I think the highest deviation between one of the divisions, between that about 38,500 number, is about 1%. So that's well within the legal requirements, which allow up to about a 10% deviation. One thing that we will recommend, though, whenever we bring this back on next Tuesday for a public hearing, is just minor adjustments to align with the census blocks. The census blocks are essentially the way that the district receives this data, and it's in a geographic shape. And that just makes it easier for the election staff at the county to go ahead and prepare ballots and do things of that nature. Terry, can you continue on? In addition to those census related changes, just solely based on the census block changes, we're also going to make some just kind of what I would call almost cleanup recommendations that primarily align with LAFCO service boundaries. The first one's going to basically include parcels annexed into the district service area since the last time that the maps have been updated. And this will just ensure those properties that have been annexed in, there are only, I think, a couple, are represented and included in a division boundary. The second thing will be realigning the division boundaries with the LAFCO service area. So since the maps were last updated, LAFCO's made a few adjustments that maybe a property was either combined with another property, or a right-of-way was removed from the district service area for one reason or another through LAFCO. And then the last thing is we'll just try to ensure that the division boundaries align with towns and city boundaries to the extent possible. This is important for county election staff because if they're preparing ballots, they know everyone. And for example, the city of San Rafael would receive either one of two ballots, or the town of Ross, for example, would have one director on the ballot. So that, and then it also allows just members of the public to know I live in the city or town and my representative at the water district's, ex-director. Okay, Terry, next slide, please. So with those things being said, the next steps on this process, statutorily, we're required to hold at least 2 public hearings before the adoption of the maps. The first public hearing will be on Tuesday night, and that's February 1st. And basically there, we're gonna have kind of a further discussion of the proposed changes that I mentioned here. We'll have detailed maps, more detailed demographic information that breaks everything down, showing the racial and ethnic makeup of the districts as well. And then at that public hearing, essentially we'll receive public comment on the proposed changes that are being presented, communities of interest, and other things that members of the public may think are important. Following up with that, depending on just the feedback that we receive at that meeting, if necessary, on February 24th at the Finance and Administration Committee, we would bring back another item to kind of tee up and address any loose ends or remaining questions, and also give the public an additional opportunity to provide comments. And then, the last public hearing that we're proposing at this point would be on March 1st. And then at that point, hopefully we would have everything addressed and all the issues resolved, and the board would be ready to adopt a resolution that contains the updated division boundaries. And this would be well in advance of that April 17th deadline. I do want to note, essentially this timeline would allow several weeks for the public to comment after these proposed changes are published. And we will be accepting public comments online. Terry, if you go to the next slide. So what we're attempting to do here, and I want to give a shout out to our public information folks and also our GIS team. We're trying to make this very accessible for members of the public and the board to be able to access these maps, proposed changes, and have all the detailed information so we can receive thoughtful public comment. The first aspect of this is the launch of a redistricting website. This is actually live right now. If you go to marinwater.org/redistricting, we have the previous September 23rd meeting information in there, today's meeting information in there. And then also we have some FAQ questions and answers for the public who may not be familiar with the process. The current division boundary maps can also be located there for members of the public that want to look at that. And then the other thing that we will be doing is we're currently updating the proposed changes with detailed maps. And members of the public will actually be able to go into the website and click each individual change, see if that's in their neighborhood, and then provide comments, if that's going to impact them negatively or positively. So that's kind of going to be our first line of public outreach and communication. The other thing is the notice of public hearings for this have been published in the IJ. The one for the February 1st meetings already went out. And then we will subsequently publish one, but prior to the March 1st meeting, just so the public's aware. Obviously, all the meetings are agendized in accordance with the Brown Act, and we also, distribute these packets to local libraries. So members of the community can see that this item's agendized and participate. The last thing is just reaching out to stakeholder groups who have expressed interest in this process. I know that I've personally had some communications with the Marin County League of Women Voters. I'm not sure if they're joining us here today or not, but we have made them aware of this, and I have noticed that they've even published this on their website, so the public's aware. All right, Terry, last slide. And at that point, that concludes my presentation for today. And if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thanks very much, Jared, for that very, very thorough presentation. I'll just remind everybody, this is an information item only, but let's start with board comments, and then we'll go to public comments. Any board comments on this item? Okay, Terry, are there any public comments on this item?
There are none.
Okay, then I'll just thank Jared again, and we'll look forward to that hearing coming up. Item 3 is board policy or resolution on water supply.
Hey, good morning, Board of Directors. Paul Sellier, Operations Director. So the board had expressed a desire to develop a policy around water supply. The past 2 years historically dry, and we know, right, we're told, experts tell us climate change indicates that we can expect more of the same more frequently and maybe more intense as we go forward in time. So I think it's certainly a prudent exercise for us to develop a policy that may well point to increasing the need to increase the water supply resiliency for the district. Also, recognizing how you might increase resiliency, water supply resiliency, there may be a myriad of ways that can be done. But primarily, we're talking about increasing the water supply through either increased storage options, or we're talking about some form of supply that we can depend upon in the form of an intertie. And storage could be, we've talked about reservoir storage, but equally groundwater banking is another form of storage. So there are just different options within those sort of broad categories. And it does, and so supply side, whether it's interties or DPR or, environmental releases using recycled water for any of those uses, that's an increase in supply, as would be desalination or in fact winter water. The key question that does come straight to the front of our minds as we think about water supply is this notion of, well, gee, how much do we need? And it's just not, how much more do we need? It's really not a trivial question that we can sort of back of the envelope sit down and say, yeah, we need 4 years. There are guidances, right, that we can look to other agencies and try to compare ourselves. But ultimately, in the face of climate change, we need to perform a little bit more considered analysis and look at a data set that helps us determine what that volume or shortfall might be. Because that number changes, right, depending on the hydrology and the length of drought that you're talking about. And so we get back to where we were, if you recall, early mid to last year, where we were talking, this is really a risk problem. And so there isn't a black and white answer for us to say, yes, 4 years, 5 years of storage, 3 years of storage is the right number. Certainly it could be a start, but really we do need a little bit more considered development of that number. And Jacobs engineering, you'll see a contract coming on the 1st, will take that on for us in tasks 4 and 5 of their analysis. They'll be looking at these key questions and developing supply and drought demand scenarios for us to think about. Are those the right risks for us to be considering, the right conditions? And then they'll evaluate these different range of water supply alternatives against those conditions, so we can see how each one might perform. And then we can come up, right, looking at where we are today, what would our shortfall be, under what frequency would that shortfall occur, and then how much supply do we need to then shore up right? That and reduce that frequency to a level that we're all comfortable with. So, so Jacobs will be a key element in identifying and using data to really help us arrive at a considered number with a rationale behind it. Of course, in the absence of that number, it still is possible for the board to develop a policy, and a robust one at that. And we've provided today just an example, and it's just a skeleton, right? And I'm sure there's a lot of detail missing that folks would like to see in there, but really, and that's the purpose of today, is for me to stop talking and for you guys to weigh in with your thoughts on it. But before I yield to that, just the proposed in there is to essentially around meeting this demand number during normal times, and then a percentage of that demand during drought times. And I would just note that the thing that struck me about that particular model was that it doesn't presuppose a level of water use efficiency that we'd be stuck to. We can invest whatever we want to on the demand control side, right, and drive that average 3-year demand down, and it hasn't affected the policy. The water supply policy is the same, and it kind of frees us up in one respect. That's just my personal, what struck me about the way Valley Water had structured their water supply policy. And then, a couple of elements from the East Bay Mud were on sort of the reporting aspects of water supply. So with that, I'm going to stop talking, and really interested for the board and anybody's thoughts on this topic, because it really is, it's pretty challenging.
Thank you, Paul. I want to note that this is also an information item, so no action to be taken today. And I want to thank Paul for a very thorough presentation. And I actually think the proposal is very elegant for all the reasons you just said, so I won't repeat them. Any board comment on this item?
I have a couple of things. Well, first of all, the proposal we're talking about is 100% down to 80% in drought times in terms of supply, which I'm fine with that. I think that's reasonable numbers. But the key, and you suggested, Paul, is really the size of the supply we have on hand, which clearly is minimal, certainly industry-wide. Other districts have greater, and I think the policy should somehow reflect a commitment to make us more secure. In other words, increase the reserve supply, so that 2+ years we have becomes 3+ or more, just to enhance the security we have. And that's not really built in the policy, at least not as I read it. But I think that goal should be out there as part of the policy, that we're doing everything we can to recognize the shortfall and to increase that.
That's good.
I would sort of echo, I think, the agreement that we all had here, which is I think that given where we are informationally, this is an elegant, I don't want to say elegant, I think this is a prudent and measured approach right now, given what we don't know, which is the outcome of our water supply resilience effort study that we're looking at for this spring. But I think this is actually fairly good, because it does focus on numbers of years of supply, because supply could be additional storage, or additional supply could be increased conservation. We don't know what's going to make the most cost-effective sense. I think it's probably going to be a mix, but I don't want to presuppose anything. I want us to go through the process. We intend to put that out in clear numbers so that we can make an informed decision. But I think in this way, we are setting a higher bar than where we're at today, which is what we ought to be doing. We ought to be recognizing that we have a substantial shift in our water supply situation, given climate change and the expected and experienced, I would say, impacts that are predicted. And so I think that this is a good first step. I can imagine us, after going through our water supply resilience assessment, that we might update this to a higher degree or a more informed way. But I like us taking some action now as we are also considering, removing restrictions that were put in place during the emergency period of the drought that we're in.
I don't want to move on without hearing from you, Larry Russell. Did you want to comment? on
Okay.
this item?
I do, and my first comment is B. I think we need to consider stop using Zoom and try another system. I am having, the reason I didn't speak up sooner, Cynthia, is I lost connection. This has happened almost every time. It is extremely difficult chairing meetings with that event. So I don't know if the Cisco system's better or Teams. Seems most of my clients are using Teams these days. So I think we should give some thought to that. But that's why I was so silent, is because I wasn't online. I don't know, Paul. I thought what you did was very interesting and good. You didn't talk about the statistical side of it very much. I was talking to George Shabanagos yesterday about exactly this subject, not about us, but in general. And we were talking about the inability to look back. And George threw out a number which I had never heard before. I'm going to have lunch with him next week. I'll figure this out a little more. Of the best we can do is look back 3.5 years. Now, I didn't ask him why 3.5 years, why he picked that number. But what he's talking about is the changes that have occurred recently, eliminating the old data, the past, which is the historical way we've always done it, right? Once in a 100-year storm, once in a 1,000-year storm, once in blah, blah, blah. So all I want to say is this. I don't know, Paul, if you're familiar with Dallas or not, but Dallas was faced with exactly this problem about 10 years ago. They had a large reservoir that went dry. And Dallas then said, okay, this is never going to happen again. And what Dallas did was built 10 years of supply. So they dug 10 new reservoirs or 9 new reservoirs surrounding the city. Now, of course, around Dallas, it's wide open spaces. So putting in extra reservoirs wasn't a big deal. But, that's sort of one way to deal with the problem of unknown, is just to put so much in that, it would take a catastrophic event to get them again. So I just want to remind us all that, this is not so, Paul is exactly right. It sounds like an easy thing. And Cynthia, you've talked about it and we've talked about it. You go back to Dana Roxon and I never could understand Dana Roxon's curves when we joined in 2005. I couldn't understand what he was talking about. I mean, I understood the words, but how he got to the numbers, there were these lines and graphs, and it went to this point. It was 33,000 acre feet or 35,000 acre feet or whatever it was. But what this really comes down to is engineering judgment. And that's the hard part, especially when you don't have all the cards in play, because we don't know the past. So it seems to me, Paul, that the best we're going to get out of the consultants is something like you have this percent chance of this outcome. That would be the absolute best we could hope for. And then I don't know how the board assesses the risk of the percent chance. In other words, if we have a 40% chance of this event occurring, well, is it really 40%? I don't know. How are we going to rub our tummies to get to that answer? And I'm not sure about that either. And I'm kind of thinking out loud here. So, I'll do some more thinking about this, but, people tend to look at tables and reports and say, oh yeah, that's the number right there. And, this is a really, really challenging problem unless you take the Dallas approach, which is just build so much that, and whether you don't have to build reservoirs, you just have to build capacity. So wherever it comes from, you need alternatives. And, and I hearken everybody back to the 1919 poll that we did, where, half of our folks thought we needed a new water source, half thought we could serve our way out of it. So we're still faced with that same problem, and we can't ignore the growth, no growth either. So those are my thoughts, Cynthia. I'm sorry, they're a little ragged. I was a little busy with other things, but anyway, that's the first shot. And like I said, Paul is exactly right. This is a real challenge.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Larry. And I don't think any of us thought you were ragged. I think the only thing I would add to your point, and I just want to make sure, point of correction in the record, I'm fairly sure you meant the 2019, not the 1919.
I meant, well, the 1919 happened too. And we did
Okay.
it again in 2019. Yes, I did mean the 2019. Thank you.
Okay.
But
Okay.
but the 2019 repeated the results of the 1919
Right.
survey that was done. They got the same answers.
Right. And then just to your quick point about half wanting one, I think that really goes to Director Schmidt's point, which I very much agree with, which is, I think our portfolio is likely going to be, a combination. It's not as though we have to take one path. So I think a combination of those things is where we're likely to wind up. Is there any more board comments?
This gets pricey. Just gets pricey though.
Well,
It's
yeah.
like having 3 cars instead of having 1 car. Yeah, 3 cars, each does his own thing. I got the long distance car and the short distance car, but it's pricey.
I think we need to see what we get from the analysis to figure out whether that's, because cost effectiveness is obviously going to be one of the factors that drives our decision making. So I think that I'm not sure that we know that yet.
I agree. Terry, do we have any public comments on this item?
I have
Yes.
one last.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Jack. I thought you were done. I apologize.
Oh, that's all right. No, I just want to make clear that my point was directed specifically at our policy. And my concern is that the policy, as we're formatting it, does not, it grows to our, where we want to be percentage-wise of supply. It doesn't address new supply. In my tenure on the board, we took on Russian River water, which is now 25% of our supply. If we had not increased the amount during that tenure, you can imagine where we would have been in this last drought, absent our access to Russian River water. So my point is that our policy should have that element in there as well.
Okay, let me just double check. Any other board comments on this item? Okay, Terry, public comment?
Yes, there are 2, Ed and then Roger Roberts. Go ahead, Ed.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'd just like to suggest that when you engage Jacobs Engineering, you ask them to do a careful evaluation of East Bay Mud's ability to use the pipeline we've talked about putting in. I spoke with someone last week who seemed to know what they were talking about at a fairly high level of East Bay Mud. I asked them about the draconian restrictions, inside use only in a catastrophe or a crisis. And the answer I got was they're very concerned about their ability to support their own system, the pressure drops and such to support our pipeline on a sustained business or basis would be really unacceptable to them, at least as they understand it now. So my suggestion is Jacobs really get a handle on East Bay Mud's ability to support a pipeline. It ultimately comes down to a question of, can it even be useful to use Los Vaqueros Reservoir, for example, or alternatively, ultimately Central Valley water. If East Bay Mud cannot push the water through to wheel it, the pipeline is basically worthless, except where we were last October in a crisis with no alternative. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Roberts?
Good morning. I'm glad to hear that you've hired or going to hire Jacobs to do a more thorough analysis. My concern is the statement that I read in the agenda today speaks of a 3-year supply, source of supply. And that confuses me because at current levels of use and considering the fact that we have a shortage of reservoir supply and also that we also have access to water contract from SCWA, I think you already have 3-year supply in hand. So why are you choosing 3-year supply as the number? I think it probably needs to be 4 years or some other number, or maybe you need to fudge that with a more clarification of what you mean by 3 years. Do you mean 3 years on top of an emergency supply of 30,000 acre feet? You need to clarify, in my opinion, what you mean by 3-year supply. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask Ben to address that briefly? My well, I don't want to, but my understanding is that we generally speak in terms of a 2-year supply based on the storage in in our own reservoirs, but I could be mistaken about that. But do you feel comfortable addressing Roger's question?
Yes, I'll start and then hand it to Paul, who has the precise numbers. But by any measure, we are not now at a 3-year supply, including local storage and our allotment from Sonoma. Paul will talk about where we are with and without it more precisely. I also don't think the draft policy or resolution as written does indicate a 3-year supply as a goal, although Director Gibson, right, did suggest a couple times we should think about, and maybe there'll be a discussion ultimately in direction to staff, how the board wants us to think about that as we proceed with the next round of drafting. Paul, can you share the specific numbers with and without Sonoma?
Yeah, and just to be clear, we're talking about storage only. We're not factoring in any particular hydrology or rainfall and runoff. So our storage level capacity in the reservoir system is 80,000 acre feet, thereabouts. And our demands are about 42,500 acre feet. So without Sonoma, if we were to meet all of our potable demand, environmental releases, and evaporative losses, we're at about 1.9 years of supply. If we were to factor in our Sonoma supply, that moves to about 2.2 years. And again, this is just straight storage and demand.
And Paul, for clarity, that is starting from a full base, right?
That's correct, Director Gibson.
Sorry. Okay. Any other public comment on this item, Terry?
There are none.
Okay.
I have one more comment, Cynthia.
Sure.
As most of you are probably aware, I fly a small airplane, and when the airplane is flown in instrument mode, you have to have the amount of gas required to get to your destination plus 45 minutes of fuel. So that's true of commercial airplanes and all airplanes. The point I'm getting at is that, you know, I think we need to start thinking about more than, instead of trying to thinly cut the slice of the tomato. You know, the more the better, kind of the Dallas approach or the airplane approach of you need all you need plus some. So kind of start thinking in that direction, because that's really the key to it, is that, you know, you don't have to get into this situation assuming we can assume normal rainfall. Now, if we don't assume normal rainfall, or normal rainfall doesn't occur, or whatever normal rainfall is, who knows? You know, that throws a whole nother curveball at the box. But one thing to keep in mind for all, including the public, is, you know, we're not making clocks here. These are engineering estimates. It's the best we can do. And, you know, the comfort has cost. And where you draw the line on how much excess you need, I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anyone sitting on this call does. I think we'll have a better picture in 6 months than we do now, but we still end up with rubbing your tummy and saying that amount is okay. I mean, Jack described it perfectly. In the 70s, we built 2 more reservoirs. Well, we'd gone along since 1912 to 1976 with the amount of storage we had was fine until it wasn't. I frankly was a little amazed at how much growth there was in the 10 years on the numbers that Jared tossed out. That I think it was some 8,000 more people. I don't know how that works out to dwellings, if that's just people having more kids, or that's more houses being built, or where they're going. But I found that number quite interesting, because that's like, you know, pushing on 5% or something like that of our population. So, you know, food for thought.
Director Kohler, I just, if I could very briefly, wanted to follow up Director Gibson's comment, because I thought it was important to reflect a minute on it, that when we look at storage, full storage, I think, is useful in comparative to other agencies. When we look at storage in terms of our water supply in context of the drought, I do think looking at an average year storage, which is notably below being full, is another important way to look at it. And certainly as we work with Jacobs on the analysis, we'll be doing both.
Okay. Anything else on this item? I just want to make sure we're covering everybody. Okay. Thank you all for that very constructive conversation. We're going to move on now to item 4, the monthly financial update. Chuck.
Before we do, I would like direction, Chair Kohler, if I could, in terms of bringing this item back and what the board would like to see, because I did hear some support for looking at it as it was drafted, understanding it's a living document that would be refined as we do the analytical work. And then I did also hear some discussion about including a goal or aspiration in terms of increasing the year, so how many years of supply we have, perhaps as well. So I'm interested if I could.
Yeah, I think both. I think there's interest in both. I'm a little reluctant without Director Bragman to weigh in. So how do people feel about bringing this back to a full board meeting where he's available to weigh in and participate in the conversation?
I think that makes
Great
sense.
idea. Great idea.
Sure.
So
Is
we'll
that
bring
okay
it
for you,
back
Ben?
as informational item. Good.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you want to bring it as an informational item so we can have more of a conversation. I don't think you want to have an action item until we've got that consensus that you're looking for.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. Now are we done? Okay. That brings us to item 4, the monthly financial update.
Good morning, Chair Kohler and directors. Just in here. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right, so this will be the update through December 31st, 2021. So we're halfway through the fiscal year. So we'll start as we always do with the revenues. So just as a benchmark for revenues and expenditures, we'd be at 50% of budget if we were tracking linearly right on with it, which we never do. But you can see that water revenues, which comprise commodity sales, water sales, service charges, and watershed management fee, were about 45% of budget at $38.8 million. And you can see a breakdown of this in attachments 1 and 3. Other revenues are at 122%. And if you look at attachment 3, you'll see that there was we listed as a grant of $2.1 million in one-time monies that we received as a federal pass-through for delinquent customers. So that's the reason that our other revenues jumped up so much in December. So if we add those together, our total operating revenues are 47.5%, tracking pretty well through December 31st. Fire flow fee, which we received via the property tax bills, at 56%, as we'd expect. We got that slug of money in December on the first tax remittances. And then our capital revenues, which are the capital maintenance fee and connection fees, are at $8.5 million, tracking about 47% of budget. And then,
Chuck, before you leave that slide, I'm reading this as not seeing a problem, which kind of surprises me given what we've been through. Am I wrong about that? In other words, we're halfway through the year, the fiscal year. So these numbers look about right, given where we are in the year. Is that a correct reading?
well, they look about right for what we budgeted. So we kind of anticipated that we were going to have a lot of savings from conservation, and we took our budget down. So we're tracking on our budget, we're okay, but hold that question for just a moment, Director Gibson. Let me talk about that a little bit on the next slide.
Okay.
Because you bring up an interesting question of patterns there. So here we kind of take what you have in attachments 1 and 2, and we break these down for you. And just as you said, you know, if we look at the fixed charges, at the service charges and the watershed fees here, we're right about on with budget, which we'd expect. Those are relatively predictable. On the volumetric side on water sales, you can see that we're at $25.7 million. So we're about 44% of budget. If you go back though, and you go back and look at 2021, and it's a different year. You had COVID, you had much less rainfall, but even then, the way the pattern of our revenues went last year is that at December 31st, we'd collected about 2/3 of our revenues. So we were at about 64%. So here we're at 44%. So, you know, I don't know what happens with the rest of the year as far as weather patterns and demand, but you know, in a normal year, if we're tracking at 44% of water sales at December 31st, we're a bit behind on budget. So yes, that could absolutely be a concern.
Okay, thank you.
And then we broke down here as we show you the monthly water sales. These are in dollars, and this includes the meter service charges and the watershed maintenance fee. And you can see in December here, we're down about 31% off of last December. And again, you know, there's a lot of variables in that. Part of that is likely conservation. Big part of that though too is rainfalls. You know, this last December we had 18.4 inches of rain, and in the previous December we had about 5 inches of rain. So you know that's driving usage a bit there too, driving down usage a bit. But you can definitely see that through the fiscal year, we've definitely had significantly less sales than the previous year. And then we break that down by the resi codes, by the different users. And you can see that overall here, we've used about 28% less in total water year-over-year comparisons. And some of the big drivers in that you can see here is single family. That's down 32% usage. Again, you know, a lot of that's probably conservation. Some of that's just having a little bit of a wetter year or a much wetter year. And then irrigation, we had savings of about 45%. So but you're getting savings in every category. And then we give you the breakdown of the consumption tiers. Not really much of interest here. You see this following the normal patterns that we see over the years. You can kind of see the previous drought that we had here, obviously more severe in 22. One interesting thing you do see here is that if you kind of go back and look at normal years per se, that you know might be fiscal year 19, fiscal year 20, we always kind of wonder about what the elasticity is for users in these upper tiers. So you can see if you look at tier 1 here in the blue, you know, you're about 20% decrease over a normal year. But these upper tiers where you're looking at 2, 3, and 4, you have decreased usage in those of about 50% in each one. So these are probably more elastic than I would have anticipated. And then we look at the AMI data. So this is through the end of the year here, and this is for areas of Tiburon, Belvedere, those 1,175 single-family residence meters that we track. And you can see very large savings in water compared to the previous year. So in December, this gray bar here, that's 49% reduction over the previous year. And in November, likewise, we have about a 50% reduction. So we've seen we saw very large reductions in water use in that area of the service area. And then we also show you the same data for institutional and business meters throughout the service area. This is a smaller sample size, about 82 meters. Here we see some savings. So in December, we saw 7% less usage. In November, we saw 18% usage. But you can really see here in last year's data where you have the real drop-offs from fiscal year 2019. So they had bigger drop-offs last year, so those have kind of been minimized a little bit this year.
Hey, Chuck, before you leave that, I found that data very interesting. It seems to me, and the risk, of course, in that data is that's a 49% decrease without outside irrigation, huh? And, you know, so all we have to get back into is outside irrigation, and we lose all that benefit. I think it speaks of two things, though. It also speaks to the value of having the AMI data available to the user so that they can see what's happening. You know, you don't wait for 90 days to get information that, oh, in June, you kind of got a little carried away with your irrigating or whatever. It's a little simpler now because I think most folks, if not all, are respecting the don't irrigate outside. And of course, nature's been kind to us and eliminated the need for outside irrigation, at least for a few more months. But anyway, I just want to make sure that, you know, everybody realizes the value of the AMI there, because I think that's a direct feedback observation that, you know, without the data, you can't do that, obviously.
Yeah, Director Russell, I think that's a good point. Just anecdotally, I know I'm in North Marin Water District, and we left a hose on one day inadvertently, and I got an email within 12 hours. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. That's the kind of thing, you know. I mean,
feedback.
I'm
there were
shocked by that.
people.
I'm shocked that you
Yeah.
did that, Chuck. I can't
Who's my
believe you
wife?
admitted it.
He's sharing the wealth, Cynthia, you know. But that's an interesting point, you know. And I don't know how, Ben, we addressed Mimi Ward's comments about Big Brother stuff. You know, I don't understand the thinking that she was expressing in that, you know, the data is useful to everyone. I mean, it isn't a punitive thing that the district is helping, that North Marin helped Chuck. It's helpful, right? It's saying, hey, be aware, there's something going on here, huh? You know, so I don't know how we get around that problem.
Well, Director Russell, I am aware anecdotally that a few agencies around the country implementing automated meter have run into that. And as I understand it, they moved forward explaining the value of this sort of system, and it was not a dominating concern of the community. And ultimately, I don't know this for sure, but I haven't heard subsequent concerns that acceptance may have just come kind of in accordance with this whole technological wave that's, you know, digital wave that's changing the face of so many things here. So.
My information matches yours. However, we have a little problem right here. So, you know, we're going to have to think about how to deal with the education of the public, that the data is just as confidential as it ever was, and it is only shared between the user and the district. I think what she was talking about was the ability to, it's kind of like the gun registration stuff. You know, if you register the guns and you know where all the guns are, it's kind of that same kind of thinking, that if you've got this tool that gives you instantaneous feedback, although it's the same feedback you get, you just get it delayed by 60 days. I mean, it's the same information the water district has. We would make the same motion if we saw a lateral leaking on a house that didn't have AMI, and we saw a bill that was all of a sudden 10 times normal. You know, we would take action. The problem is it had been going on since whenever, until the meter reader read it. So, you know, I think that's the information you have to get across, is it's exactly the same situation we're in now. It's just with a shortened time period. There's no difference in the data. It's just available quicker. That's all I got, Chuck. Sorry.
No, no worries. Okay, so we'll go on to expenditures here. So again, just kind of keeping track that we're 50% through the fiscal year here. So personnel services, those are tracking right about where you'd expect. We're always usually a little bit behind budget on that because we have some static vacancies all the time. Maintenance and operating expenses are right about at 50%, a little bit over. But you know, if you're looking at attachment 3 there, you can see we've had some higher spending, as you would imagine, on things like conservation. And then financing costs are right at 50% because we just spread those throughout the year. So that's kind of artificial. Capital allocation, those salaries that we moved to CIP projects, capital projects, that's about 47.2%, so tracking right with budget. And fire flow projects were about 20%. And then district projects, which include those capital equipment purchases, we're at about 27.7%. But on those ones, what we started doing is kind of giving you, I think, a more accurate look. So you can see that if you add in capital encumbrances, so those are contracts that we've entered into for things like the generators at San Geronimo, we actually are tracking right about 50% overall with our budget. And you can see that our capital expenditures are right about 50% too when we add in those encumbrances. And then finally,
could you go back to 2 slides? One more. So do you expect the fire flow? I mean, that's a substantial deviation. I don't say deviation, but it's a very small percentage from, you know, with the fire flow project. Do you expect that other, you know, whatever I can do quick math, 5.2 million to come in the next 6 months, or is this are we going to track low compared to our budget?
So this is the expenditure side. So the fire flow revenue is coming in, you know, as expected. Because it's under the capital projects, these things are kind of they don't move evenly like the operating costs do. So we could have a big project come in the spring that right away brings this up to 100%. So before we were kind of they had actually run the fund balance down for fire flow projects, so they were kind of by design slowing down projects and building up the fund balance. So you know, there's a little bit of that here too. But again, because it's capital projects, this could change, you know, within a couple months depending on what they do. So hope that answers your question. I don't know. I don't personally, I don't expect what the projects are there, but we could find out.
Yeah, I'm just because it's such a significant difference, you know, if you, because then your next slide goes on to present that we are actually closer to 50%, but if those other projects are coming in, then you know, I'm just wondering whether we have a substantial difference that's going to carry through the rest of the year. But it doesn't sound like you have that information at hand, so we can keep going.
I would briefly note that Crystal will be providing updates on the capital program to the board in context of the projects we have on our plate, making difficult decisions in terms of prioritization. So through this year, we are expecting to meet our full budget in terms of the CIP that brings in the fire flow projects as well.
Yeah, and so now we'll take a look at fund balances, and here, you know, Director Schmidt, you can kind of see here is they're kind of increasing that fund balance in the fire flow fund as we talked about. So that the funding there is discretely accounted for. So even if they don't, you know, do the amount of projects that they were expecting this year, that money would be carried over for projects in the next year. So that may actually at that point go over budget. So it's just a flow of the revenues coming in, the expenditures going out don't always add up with capital projects. So the restricted and designated funds, so those are things that we keep for things like workers' comp. That's right at $19.7 million. Hasn't really moved much since the beginning of the fiscal year, which is this column here. A rate stabilization fund, which we'll show you on the next slide in a little more detail. We've spent that down during the drought, and that was by design. Fire flow fund, that's increased by $1 million since the beginning of the fiscal year. Pension reserve fund is remained at $2 million for several years. And then our capital fund is healthy at about $26 million, or 1 year of capital expenditures per policy. Our operating unrestricted fund has fallen from $32.6 million down to $23.9 million. Again, this is what we think of as our reserve. And again, by design, this is what we rely on during the drought to kind of backfill those losses in revenues. And then as far as the coverage of the budget in months, we're 3.1 with that $23.9 million. So if we had to, we could float all expenditures for 3 months without any incoming revenues. Debt coverage is projected the end of the year to be 1.4. outstanding bonded debt at 139.3 million. That's just our large bonds. And then the smaller debt that we have at $6.9 million for a total debt of $146.2 million.
Chuck, could you just touch on the debt service coverage issue that we're looking at it? The drop is somewhat transitory.
Yeah, yes, it is a transitory drop, but we're usually well above 2.0. We by policies, the district aim for 1.5, and then by the debt covenants, we have to be at 1.25. So we're okay here. This is, though, as Ben said, transitory just because of the drop in our revenues. But as soon as demand starts going back up and those revenues normalize again, which they typically do after a drought, we'll see this debt service coverage go back probably north of 2 or 3. And then to give you a breakdown of the reserves, these are the 2 different funds that you're looking at here. Rate stabilization fund here, 2.6, and then we're looking at the operating unrestricted fund or reserve there. So these are 2 separate funds. So you can kind of see here what we showed you in the previous slide. We've dropped down from $9.4 million at July 1st down to $2.55 million now. You can see the sources of this. We had the emergency intertie project we spent about $4.15 million on. Castagna, $1.35 million, about $150,000 on the Peacock Gap recycled water transmission project. And then we transferred money, $1.2 million. You can see that transfer going into the unrestricted fund. And then out of the unrestricted fund, we've spent about $1.7 million there on the drought-related operating costs. Those were things like the staff time for the water patrols that we had earlier, advertising, items like that. And then the water conservation rebate programs, we transferred in $880,000 for those. And then the backfill of revenue here is about a little over $8 million. So we've spent that down to $23.9 million. Again, that's, gives you about 3.1 months in coverage for the budget. And then at the general manager's request, we just, we took this out and projected for the end of the year. How do we think we're going to look at June 30th? So just based on, what we think we're going to continue to spend in conservation programs. And, as Director Gibson brought up, that kind of deficit that we're looking at in revenue, we think that we'll wind up at $1.65 million in the rate stabilization fund at June 30, and we'll wind up with about $21 million in the operating unrestricted fund at June 30th. So those are our projections. And again, these projections, there's a lot of variables involved here. So, if we had a very, very dry spring and revenues went up, these numbers could change pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
As would our storage of water.
Right. So in summary, we absolutely see the drought impacting revenues, but that's to be expected, and it was planned for, and that's the reason we have the healthy reserve levels that we went into this with. Expenditures side is tracking almost right on with budget, and our reserve balances, again, by design, are declining.
And Chuck, if I could just note on that last bullet, as we over this next year do our cost of service study that we'll be doing, we'll certainly be looking and talking to the board about a strategy over time of replenishing the reserves, particularly the rate stabilization reserve that, right, by design was so useful during this drought. We'll want a strategy most likely to replenish it.
I agree with that. I'm a little concerned that we may be in our reserve fund in part might have been built around, much like our water supply. We're finding that we are, experiencing greater stressors on our water supply and our use and our budget, and that reserve fund is, I think it's in many ways it's kind of like tied to our water supply. We ought to have a bigger reserve to be better prepared for these kind of situations. So I'm glad we're going to take that up.
Yeah, again, Monty, that's not a simple question either. There are no guidelines for how much of the user's money we should sit on. it's really just a matter of judgment, and it's hard. That money has to come right out of rates, and it's just sitting in the bank at 0.5% interest or whatever we get for the money. So keep that in mind. Again, it's an easy thing to say, but it's not so easy from an implementation standpoint.
I might just add, I take both of your points. What I was hearing from Chuck was actually a fairly positive scenario, right? These were, I mean, I think Chuck, and I appreciate your making this point that this was the plan. This was anticipated. We planned for it. The plan worked as we, was implemented as we anticipated it would be. So I think that is positive. It doesn't mean that we can't make adjustments and do more in the future, but I think this is in general a good news about the district's foresight in setting up these these reserves and and in the way they were used. So anyway,
I agree completely with your statement, Cynthia. And further, and you've all heard me say this before, for most of my career, 80-90% of it, these reserves were called drought reserves. That's what they were always called. We call them rate stabilization reserves, but what they are is when the revenue drops from lack of availability or use of water, you supply the money with the reserves. So we've gone away from calling them drought reserves, but you just perfectly characterize them as drought reserves, because that's exactly what they were. We ran into a problem with the availability of water and subsequently the sales of water, and we used the reserves to keep the ship afloat.
Right. So I just want to be mindful of time. I know two of us have a hard stop at 11. We need to go to public comment on this item. We have two more items. Is there any more board discussion on this? Okay, Terry, do we have public comment on this item?
Yes, Roger Roberts. Go ahead, Mr. Roberts.
Yes, I don't know what the cash flow situation is for the water district, but it does look like currently you're not selling enough water to cover operating expenses. And I see that there is going to be a drawdown of the stabilization reserves, but that's something that you're going to have to remedy, and I'm glad you're recognizing that. If we don't have increased water sales because people have changed their habits and because we are fortunate with having, low temperatures and everything's nice and green, I wonder whether or not we're going to have to accelerate, if you will, financing of replacement of the reserves. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good question, Roger.
Any other public comments?
There are no other comments.
Okay, then I'd like to move on, if the board is amenable, to item 5, which is the quarterly investment update.
This is a relatively quick item, Chair Kohler. So you have the report in your attachments there. We currently have $77.3 million in the portfolio. I think most of that is held within WAIF, per usual. And WAIF right now is earning 21 basis points. Our portfolio right now is about 19 basis points, a little bit below that because we keep some of that in corporate obligations and checking. And then here we show you, as usual, the yield curve going out to the 5-year on treasuries. And you can kind of see how this yield curve's been steepening. We are seeing, rates at the long end of the yield curve, 5 years starting to go up. So right now it's prudent to stay in short. As these rates go up, the value of any long-term bonds that you hold go down, giving you unrealized losses. So that's where we sit at this point.
Let's put it a different way, Chuck. We're losing about 5% per year on the money that's held by them due to inflation, huh? Current rates of inflation.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. But I think
so it was even worse than I mentioned. I thought it was 0.5%. It's 0.2%.
Yep.
So
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm not sure we'd have any investment available to us right now that would overtake the current rates of inflation. So
Understand.
keeping up as
I'm
best
just
you can. Yep.
just making a statement, not a complaint.
Any other board comments on this item? Okay, do we have any public comment on this item, Terry?
There are none.
Okay, well then I will thank Chuck for that, that presentation. And then that brings us to item 6, the annual review of policy 33 about our investment policy.
Chair Kohler and directors, and this is really a housekeeping item. We're required to bring the investment policy back for the board's review each year. So that's what this is. This year we do not have. We've looked at the state code. We're in compliance, and we have not made or recommended any changes to the investment policy.
Okay.
What about Director Bragman's point, Chuck, about looking at Ginnie Mae or whichever one of those he was talking about? Have we done that?
We have looked at that. And the
Okay.
last quarter, I actually talked to one of our brokers, and he advised me against that at this time. And primarily that's because of what you see on that yield curve there. It's also difficult to find those within our 5-year investment term. We do continue to look for other ways to make more yield if we can, but our first considerations are liquidity and security. So.
Yes, sir. No question.
So just to remind everybody, this is an information item, so there's no action required today. But I want to make sure that we're hearing all board comments on Chuck's recommendation. Okay, Terry, any public comments on this item?
There are none. There are none.
Right. Then my concern about time was overly pessimistic. We're good. I'm going to wish everybody a happy Thursday, and we'll see you next time.
Good
I
job.
have one more thing. One
Good
more thing,
job.
Cynthia. One more thing,
Yes.
Chuck. When I received my second W-2 from the district, and I'm not sure why I received 2 of them, my address and social security number were showing full on in the actual envelope. It's a window envelope. And I'm not sure why we have a full social security number on a W-2, because the copy coming to I don't think the copy coming to the employee has to have a full social security number shown. I'm not positive of that, but I don't think that's the case. And in any case, I don't know, the second W-2 came from a San Francisco mailing address. The first one was a multi-paged form, like the normal kind of W-2 thing you see. The second one was a longer form looking like a check. But in the window, like I say, my social security number was fully exposed.
Wow.
That shouldn't be.
No, and you know, in the way the post office works these days, they scan all your mail, which is then emailed to you if you request it, which means someone else could email it, could see it too. And like I say, they have the name, the address, and the social security number. So I don't know who stuffed those. I don't know why there's 2 of them, but they need to be stuffed in deeper. The device will go deeper in the envelope and hide that information, but that's not the way mine came.
Okay, we'll take a look at that, Director Russell.
Hopefully I'm the only one, but I doubt it.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'm done, Cynthia.
No worries. Anything else that people want to talk about before we go? Okay, have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.